Okay, so as promised, here is the second part of the first episode of In Retrospect, a vlog, possibly a podcast, if I get these uploaded on Spotify at some point, about looking at things in retrospect. It's about nostalgia and every sort of spin-off of that topic. Because I think most things I'm going to talk about are going to draw back to that in one way or another. But today we're talking about liminal spaces. I posted a video about a week ago with some ambient music that I played on my Arturia Micro Freak synthesizer, and a compilation of liminal spaces, pictures that I have found from Reddit and Tumblr and different parts of the internet. These places that are often described as familiar places, familiar yet uncomfortable places, or sometimes the videos say places from your nightmares, these places that you remember from your dreams, and whatever those sort of clickbaity titles that might be there. Hopefully there won't be too much feedback if I move this mic around. We'll see how that goes. So the definition, we'll start off of what it means. Liminal is a word that means, transition, relating to a transitional or initial stage of a process, occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary or threshold. In a liminal space that comes up, this is from the Aesthetics Wiki, when I search it on Google. So a liminal space is an aesthetic that refers to the feeling of being in a transitional, pardon me, space that has become abandoned. A mall at 4 a.m. or a school hallway in summer, for example. This makes it feel frozen and slightly unsettling. And I think that's a good description. I think the easiest way to understand how so many of us relate to these pictures and these spaces is that there is a strange uniformity to a lot of them, especially some of the more interesting ones. I think a lot of the ones that get more views will have these pictures of sort of like party spaces at skate rinks or a laser tag or something like that, with these galaxy designs, these party designs, these neon lights and whatnot. Very 90s aesthetic, very 80s aesthetic, even at times. And sometimes just these places that have been abandoned and weren't updated until very later on in life, or maybe even not at all, from like the 70s or the 80s. And that's something that a lot of people pointed out when, say, Kmart and Sears started to close these big franchises that we knew as kids. You know, if I went shopping, my mom loved Sears. She loved JCPenney, loved Kmart. Never wanted to go to Walmart because Walmart was always so busy. And I'm just going to play real quiet while I talk here for a minute. And I think that was kind of the appeal that initially hit me when I started to see these videos. And maybe some others have had this similar experience, is, you know, if you look at a Kmart, if you look at a Sears, they didn't update for the longest time. And even, you know, Target has been a much more successful sort of business. Yeah, you know, Target is still doing pretty well, but the kind of thing that they share in common with Target is, like, as much as Target has kept relevant with prices and products and whatnot, if you look at a lot of Target stores, for a good while, they had a lot of similar things, and they have been updating in the past 5 years, and I imagine some in the past 10. But I always think of, like, there's a John Hughes movie that is one of my favorites of his. Big John Hughes fan, by the way. Shout out to John Hughes fans and his movies. Big movie that I really love that did kind of not great. I believe it was just a mild success, is Career Opportunities. And a lot of that movie takes place inside of a Target store that they filmed in, I believe, 1990, maybe a little bit of 1989. The movie came out in 91, and watching that movie reminds me so much of when I first started. I'm from Ohio, and I started working at a camp in Minnesota in my 20s, you know, in the early 2000s. I like to call them the aughts. And during that time is when I was first introduced to Target, because there really weren't many Targets around where I was living in Ohio. And what I remember of those, like the CD sections and the clothing sections and everything, the layout is so much similar. There's so much of it that looks just like that Target where that was filmed. I can't even remember where that Target was filmed in that movie. Career Opportunities. But I think that that's a good sort of story that relates to what I felt personally when I first saw these liminal space videos. Was it kind of reminded me of watching career opportunities and seeing this Target from 1990 and thinking, man, I can remember going into Target in the year 2005, it would have been, and there was a lot of similarities. And to an even larger extent, I can remember watching videos of different Kmarts that were closing down and seeing some of the items and the sections that they had and thinking, wow, this looks a lot like the Kmart at my hometown in the 90s. And there's that feeling, that nostalgia that hits you. And something I'll need to look into a bit more when I talk about my thoughts on nostalgia in general, which I'll probably do more than one episode on, is that nostalgia has been described as somewhat of a drug. It's got a very euphoric sort of appeal to a lot of people, a very euphoric kind of effect. And I think part of that is because we only tend to remember kind of the good things about a lot of our memories, and that makes sense. You know, from sort of, I don't know what any of you might believe about evolution and the development of our race. Regardless of what you believe about that, you can kind of see that there's this idea that we adapt to our situations and we try to protect ourselves from things that are dark and things that are terrible, and so nostalgia can become a bit of a coping mechanism. And I think that's part of the reason why liminal spaces are so interesting to many of us, and I know that's part of the reason why they're interesting to me, because it's so kind of intriguing to see these pictures that are of old restaurants, and you look it up and you realize eventually, oh, that's a retro Taco Bell. They used to have a lot of the pinks and the teals, the aquamarine colors on their tables and their chairs. And most of them don't look like that anymore. And if you take out the context, you know, if you have a picture that doesn't really show people there, that doesn't show the signs and the menu items and whatnot, and you're just left with, oh, this is a building, there's still that familiarity in the back of your head. Or if it's an abandoned place especially, there's this interest with many, and I know with myself as well, of watching people explore abandoned places, abandoned areas. And there's just this weird feeling, especially when those places are abandoned, but there's a lot of it kept intact. My dad used to tell me stories of going through houses on occasion that had been abandoned. He was in the military, and I won't, get into too much, but finding places that had calendars on the wall of years that had long gone, and I remember that being one of the weirdest stories I thought I'd ever heard as a child. But now, like, I've seen Dan Bell, Bright Sun Films, Uncharted Travel. I know Phalen, Phalen, I believe it is. Or, no. Yeah. I think that's the channel. I'd have to look it up. He used to post some videos where they would go through abandoned houses and whatnot. And you see these places that sometimes someone passed away. And so there's still a lot of stuff from when they were alive. And no one has come in and moved things. And sometimes no one's come in and moved things for years. And maybe someone died or someone left the house and they didn't have anyone close to them, and this house is out virtually in the wilderness, and there's VHS tapes and televisions that are still working, and you walk around in there, and even just watching the video, there's like this part of me that thinks like, oh, somebody's gonna walk up behind them and, what are you doing in my house? Sort of deal. And so I think that there's that kind of eerie feeling that is maybe a little bit similar to when we watch horror movies, but even more so similar to going back and visiting these places of our childhood and tapping into that nostalgia, tapping into those memories. And again, we tend to remember a lot of the good. And if not, we want to focus on the good. And sure, there's a lot of people who have gone through traumatic experiences and those happenings, and I can't speak to that to some extent. I don't know if there is that connection, but there's, I believe, this sort of attraction to connecting with our past selves and remembering these times where we remember being truly happy. And maybe a bit of wanting to sort of reach back into the past and, have that ability to tap into our thoughts, kind of speak to our past selves and want to figure out how we might be happy like that again, have that feeling of fulfillment that we believe that we lost, and re-experience things for the first time. And there's a certain uneasiness looking at these places and hearing this music that seems to, I think, urge us to consider everything, to a certain extent, at least. Because, I can remember throughout different points in my life having that feeling, that transitional feeling that is liminal, of moving from one place to another, and being on an airplane is that transitional feeling, or lying awake at night after a big event, after a day where you start a new job, you leave an old job, something like that. You move, relationship ends. It makes me think of when my parents moved to a new place. The layout of that house is really similar to my grandmother's old house. And I had these dreams about that place for years when I moved. And she hadn't lived in that house for a good long while. When I moved up to North Dakota, but I started having these dreams again. And, sometimes it was just visiting family, and that makes sense because at the time she had lived in that house, that first house, for longer than she lived in the one she lives out now out in the country. I won't say where, but we had more experiences in that place. But I would have these dreams of visiting there, and there would be nobody else, and just walking through that house, and it would be empty now. And that's kind of, I think, part of what watching these videos about these liminal spaces reminds me of. Or going to a mall that isn't busy. You sort of feel like there should be tons of people there, but there isn't. I really think dead malls, like the kind of videos that Dan Bell posted quite a bit, still does, every few months, these videos about dead malls, with vaporwave and mall soft music. There's this eerie feeling of like these big gigantic places that I think a lot of us 90s kids have these great memories of being full of life, being these places where we went to get video games, buy clothes and whatnot, just to shop. When I was a kid, if we went out, sometimes as a family, pretty often, number of times in the year, we were going to a mall. And then we'd go out to eat afterward, but we'd, go shopping, and I would go to the electronics boutique or the Babbage's Yeah, Sulphur, etc. I think there's a few different malls that we went to, and I remember all those stores. GameStop was later on. And so dead malls, Kmarts in the recent years, Sears, those have all kind of become liminal spaces to a certain extent because there's often no people there, and you associate it with a place where people kind of should be, and it's abandoned. And an abandoned place isn't necessarily a liminal space to a certain extent, though in some ways it is. We feel that sort of heaviness on our hearts, like walking through a graveyard or anywhere that there was life and there is no more. Kind of feeling of existential dread over us. But I also think I'm going to go over here and maybe play a little guitar as I wrap it up. I also think that there's this comfort to liminal spaces, especially when I hear the videos done with appropriate music, which to me, ambient music in the form of chill wave, vaporwave, mall soft, post rock, all of that really, fits with the aesthetic of these places. It's my microphone. It really fits with the aesthetic of these places. And there's this connection that it has with us internally. Existentially, that tends to connect to who we are and who we're becoming. I guess before we all have that once, and it's happened to our happy returns. Maybe you don't. Maybe you are someone who had a harder childhood. Maybe you didn't have a lot of friends, and maybe your life is much better. And maybe you're getting into some old media, some nostalgic things that you didn't get to experience when you were a kid. Maybe you are. Maybe you're fully embracing things in the past 10 years or whatever. You can be nostalgic for things that happened just a few years ago. But I doubt you're listening to this channel and listening to this podcast and you're not all interested in nostalgia and that. So, what I want to do, I guess, as I wrap this up, is I wanna say, if you listen to this maybe months from now or days from now, if you listen to it an hour after it's posted, tell me why you're interested in this sort of thing, why liminal spaces sparked your curiosity, and stories, examples in your own life where you felt that transition, you felt that connection